as it develops. Tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine following Sunday's incident in which Russia fired on and seized 3 Ukrainian naval ships in the Kerch Strait. Ukraine's parliament voted to impose martial law in certain regions as fears rise that the tensions could elevate to a full-blown conflict. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel just sat down for an exclusive interview with the president of Ukraine, and he joins me now from Kiev. Richard, good to see you. During the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine didn't impose martial law. Why have they decided to do so now, and what does that mean in this conflict?
So in 2014, the Russian forces, who weren't wearing uniforms at the time, imposed their rule, took over Crimea, while there was a revolution taking place here where I am in Kiev. The government was still very much in flux, and they lost the territory of Crimea. The president of Ukraine, who I just spoke to a few minutes ago, does not want to see that happen again. He fears that they lost Crimea in 2014, and now they could lose the Azov Sea, which is the water that separates Russia from Crimea, and it was in that area where this naval confrontation took place. So he explained that he imposed martial law in 10 provinces in these areas along the Russian border in order to make it easier for him to call up troops, should that be necessary, in order to mobilize personnel, in order to have his forces ready should this escalate even further and become an actual armed conflict. Let's listen to a little bit of what he said.
We're preparing for protecting our country. Martial law does not mean that we do not attack anybody. We do it just for protect our country.
No, what I'm saying is, by putting in martial law, are you preparing for a possible war?
Yeah. We just be better preparing to protect our country.
So he said he's putting this country in a defensive mode. He thinks that what we saw over the last couple of days is potentially a Russian precursor for an invasion. He thinks that Russia wants to take over the Sea of Azov and that use that area potentially even as a launching ground to launch a ground assault against Ukrainian cities. So this was a president who is very concerned that this is not over, that the Russian forces are still holding 24 Ukrainian sailors. He not only wants them to be returned, he thinks that this could be just the start of more Russian aggression toward his country.
Richard, I saw a tweet where you have talked to, I think, a U.S. official who suggested that Putin is testing the waters, so to speak. He's sort of seeing what Trump's response is going to be and what it might be if they engage in a bigger land grab in Ukraine. We are headed toward the G20 in Buenos Aires later this week. What's going to happen? Is Trump going to say to Vladimir Putin, this wasn't right? I mean, he had a lot to say about Russia going into Crimea in 2014. He blamed Barack Obama for that. Is he going to put his foot down on this?
Well, that's exactly the concern here, and I think that's why Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, did this interview right on the right in advance of the G20. The world saw what happened 4.5 years ago in Ukraine. Russian forces moved in. Again, they were described as little green men because they weren't wearing Russian uniforms, but everybody knew who they were, and they lost that territory. Now, many people, including the government of Ukraine, believe that what we're seeing now are Russian probing missions, that Russia's pushing it, seeing how far it can go, not to grab the land this time, but to take the Sea of Azov. And the President Poroshenko said that while he knows that President Trump and Vladimir Putin will be meeting or expected to meet at the G20, he said that he would have one message that he would like President Trump to deliver to Vladimir Putin. Let's take a listen.
What message would you like President Trump to deliver to Vladimir Putin?
There is two versions. One is a Normandy format, Minsk agreement, the de-escalation situation in Azov, and the occupation of the Crimea, and many, many other things. But if it would make long story short, and just in 2 words, please get out from Ukraine, Mr. Putin.
That would be the message.
So couldn't get a simpler message than that, asking President Trump to tell Vladimir Putin to get out of Ukraine. The president of Ukraine said he has also had a telephone call with Secretary of State Pompeo in which he did receive U.S. assurances that the United States is determined to protect Ukrainian sovereignty.
And before I say goodnight to you,
of course, Russia says that this was a Ukrainian. It's important to say Russia says that this was a Ukrainian provocation, and that its forces were simply acting to defend Russian territorial
So to that
water.
point, I want to just put up the map of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea to understand that if Russia doesn't allow traffic through the Kerch Strait, which at its narrowest point is about 3 miles, there's no way for Ukraine to access about 50% of its coastline, which is all on the Sea of Azov. So that's worth understanding the geography on that. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your reporting. Richard Engel in Kiev, Ukraine, for us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.